Let me start with the observation that we are finite beings and have finite intelligences. And it behooves us to see exactly how far that intelligence can extend. Now, it's said that we require God to give our lives significance. I actually am more inclined to think we require God, if we require God, it's to give us self-importance, which is a very different thing. And I also think that it's inappropriate for us to look for foundations. That I'm a very great devotee of anti-foundationalism in our thinking and in the way we approach things like ethical values. That does not mean that anything goes. It means that we should not look outside our practices, outside the things we do, outside the area in which we live our lives, for a transcendent source of meaning, a transcendent source of value. Now, that is not inconsistent with the existence of a God, with the existence of a creator, with the existence of someone who started off the Big Bang. But I see no particular evidence that that particular creator, whoever he, she, it may be, is someone whose conduct, as it were, or whose example should order my life. Now, Professor Craig has said that he's given independent arguments for the existence of the Christian God, or as the source of good, the existence of the Creator as the first cause. Well, actually, Aquinas gave 5 ways, and there's a strong affinity between the various versions, as it were, of the nature of God that Aquinas produces and some of those that Dr. Craig has produced. For Aquinas, God was the prime mover, the first cause, the absolutely necessary being, the source of good, and then finally the designer of the universe, who put purpose into the universe. Now, far be it from strengthening each other, this now needs a superproof. God, Aquinas says of all of them, and this men call God. But it doesn't seem to me that he's established that there is an individual who has all these things. We now have, even if all the proofs go through and all these arguments go through, we have to establish that these qualities they coexist in the one individual. And it seems to me no discussion of the arguments for the existence of God has dealt with that problem. Finally, in terms of the priority of faith to our practices, our virtues as they reveal themselves in our practices and how we feel about them. And it's important to notice these are practices and how we feel with them and how we can live with them, rather than just things we do, if you like, wantonly. And here I'm actually going to go to St. Paul in Corinthians, who talks about that wonderful quality of caring for others, that supreme social quality of caring lovingly for others, which got known as charity. And I'm deliberately going to quote St. Paul in the King James Version, because it indicates something about the enduringness of traditions, that this tradition, the Christian tradition, which, as I say, took over the pagan virtues and called them the 4 cardinal virtues, and then became the Western tradition, that St. Paul can write something which we can believe in today. And when I say charity, as becomes apparent from St. Paul's words, it does not just mean writing out a check to United Way every 6 months or so. Notice the priority, as I say, of our acts, our attitudes to beliefs. 10 seconds. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass and as a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and though I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and have no charity, I am nothing. And though I have all faith that could remove mountains, if I have no charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have no charity, it profiteth me nothing. And he ends that wonderful passage by giving priority, as I said, to this supreme social virtue. He says, now abideth faith, hope, charity, and the greatest of these is charity. Thank you.
Well, in tonight's debate, I've tried to argue two horns of my argument. First, that agnosticism is untenable in a variety of ways. I think we've seen that ordinary agnosticism really is untenable, that there's no one who can give you an argument to show you that you can't know that God exists. Secondly, I've argued that practically ordinary agnosticism is improbable. As you go through life, the scales of the evidence will tip one way or another in your thinking, and you need to decide, probably God does exist or probably he does not. And of course, it's my hope that you'll conclude that probably he does. Thirdly, I've said that agnosticism is existentially untenable, that if we don't know if God exists, then we really don't know how to live, because we don't know whether a life is meaningful or whether there are objective moral values. Dr. Hughes has admitted in his last speech that we do need God for self-importance, but we don't need him for meaning in life. It seems to me that these are inseparable. If there is no God, then that means that humanity and ourselves are no more significant or important than a barnyard of pigs or a swarm of mosquitoes. The same blind evolutionary process that coughed them all up will eventually swallow them all up again, and all will perish in the heat death of the universe. It ultimately makes no difference how you live. It's in that context that the passage on St. Paul's writing on charity becomes so poignant, because of course charity was the word that Paul used for God's love. Charity among human beings is rooted in God, who first loved us, and Paul says loved us so much that while we were still sinners, he sent his son Jesus Christ to die for us, to reconcile us to himself. So that for Paul, these values were rooted in God. And what's so tragic about atheism is that all of this is ultimately futile. Charity, goodwill, peacefulness, helpfulness, sacrifice, all of it is meaningless and comes to nothing. If we live our lives, I think, then in such a way that we do affirm meaningfulness and value, then clearly we implicitly imply that God exists. Dr. Hughes says on his view that moral values are simply without any foundation. Well, that's in a sense just another way of saying they're groundless. They're just baseless on that view. They're just sort of floating in the air without any reason to regard them as objectively true. What I'm offering is not a different set of values, but rather a foundation in your worldview for affirming those values that I think we all sense and hold to, like charity. Finally, you can be a Christian and still be a rational agnostic. We all agree on that point. So what about the arguments to think that Christianity is rationally well-founded? First, I argue the evidence points to a creator of the universe. Dr. Hughes says, well, that doesn't prove there's only one God. Well, that's sort of an ornery agnostic, I think. Granted, it doesn't prove that, but is there any probability that there is more than one God, rather than a single designer and creator of the universe? I'd use Occam's razor, which says don't multiply causes beyond necessity. Necessity requires a personal, intelligent creator of the universe and source of moral values, and one is enough. Moreover, we know that there is only one God because he's revealed himself in Jesus Christ as the God of Jewish monotheism. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and him only shall you serve. So that insofar as we have evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, we have evidence for one God. The argument from design, the argument from moral values, the argument from the resurrection, I think all supply good grounds for believing in Christian theism. Finally, I want to pick up on one last point. Dr. Hughes says we're finite beings with finite intelligence, grasping to find and make meaning to life and make sense of the universe. Certainly that's true. And God would be a cruel and unloving God if he simply left it to our own finite ingenuity to figure out whether he exists or not. But the good news of the New Testament is that God hasn't left it to us to figure out whether he's there. He has entered into history and revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, and has confirmed that by his resurrection from the dead. Wholly apart from arguments, I believe that you can know God exists by experiencing him as a personal reality in your life. I wasn't raised in a Christian home myself, but as a teenager, as a junior in high school, I heard this message for the first time and began to read the New Testament. And I found in the person of Jesus Christ somebody real and authentic, and came to devote my life to him. And I experienced a sort of spiritual rebirth into my own life that brought God into my life in a way in which he was an undeniable and daily reality. And I believe you can find this same reality yourself if you'll seek for it with an open mind and an open heart. Thank you.
Okay, my question is this. You seem to argue the premise that infinity is purely a rational reality and that it can't be external. And yet I believe in the Bible it states that God has always existed and always will exist and is eternal. So what does that say about the quality of the existence of God? Does that not make God's existence purely rational?
This is an excellent question, and I think the answer is that when the Bible speaks of God as eternal, I take this not to imply that God has endured infinitely throughout time in the past, but rather God, as he exists alone without creation, exists timelessly. And traditionally, this is a way Christian theologians classically understood God's existence, was that God exists timelessly. I think this is especially intelligible on a kind of relational view of time, according to which time would not exist in the absence of any lapse of events. In a state of changelessness, there would be no passage of time. And God, as he exists alone without the universe, would exist changelessly and therefore timelessly. And then time would begin at the moment of the creation of the universe. So space and time have their origin at the moment of creation, and God does not endure through an infinite, empty time prior to creation.
My question is with belief and unbelief. I know that example is if you go to a store and you pick up a can, if that can has a label that says tomatoes, you cannot see the tomatoes, you cannot smell the tomatoes, you can't feel the tomatoes, but yet by the witness of what's on that can, you go ahead and buy the can. There's no, if there's unbelief, you're going to go ahead and put the can back, so there's not tomatoes in there, there's something else. But if there is belief, you're going to go ahead and buy that can of tomatoes. And I'm saying this also with God. God is either belief in God or not belief in God. There's only, if you believe the Lord, or if you don't believe, there's not really such a thing as agnostic, is what I'm saying. The question is with that belief, the Bible says that faith is the evidence of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And we know that in the King James Bible it says the witness, if you believe the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. And if you believe the witness of man, or mankind putting that label on that tomatoes, why can't you believe the witness of God?
Would you come to the question? What is the question?
If you believe the witness of men, that on that can of tomatoes, it has a label, and you cannot see the tomatoes, and you cannot smell the tomatoes, but you actually, by the witness of man, you go ahead and take that can of tomatoes and you buy it, and you take it home, and you open it up, and you know it's tomatoes. And that's the same thing with God. God, well, that's an example, but God is faith.
I'm sorry, there doesn't seem to be a question outside of the management of the produce section.
No, I'm not saying, I'm saying belief is something.
The question as I
Question, Dr. Hughes?
The question as I understand it is this, that as you say, it's a matter of faith, a kind of low-grade everyday faith, which we display when we go to the produce store. And if we have a higher, superior grade of faith, the kind that gives you faith in God, why is that not? Why do you not trust that faith in the same way that you implicitly trust the manufacturers and so on of the produce gang, right?
Yeah, the Bible says if you believe the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. And
that's right.
And the witness of God is the King James Bible.
Okay. Now that the question I was addressing here in this debate, I think Dr. Craig was too, was the extent to which faith can be buttressed by argument so that we can have a fully rational belief in God, as opposed to what is probably called, I think, simple faith. And I don't mean to underestimate it by calling it simple faith. So that if you have that faith, and also if the faith extends to your thinking that the Bible is easy to interpret and easy to understand, then by all means go to the Bible for witness. But I don't think the Bible is easy to understand. I don't think that it's a transparent document in any sense at all. I think it's a very difficult document, and very often a very profound document. But I don't think it gives you unequivocal guidance for whatever you want to do.
Dr. Craig?
It seems to me this is related to the point that I was making about belief in God as a properly basic belief, not founded on argument. And the analogy I would use there would not be one of the tomatoes, but say you want to go and find out if the boss is in the office or not. And so you go and talk to the secretary, and she says, yes, he's in the office. And then you see maybe the light under the door, and you hear voices through the door. And on the basis of this evidence, you conclude, yes, it's probable that the boss is in the office. Or what you could do is you could go to the office door, open the door, and meet the boss face to face. When once you've met the boss face to face, then the evidence of the secretary's testimony, the voice through the door, the light, and so forth, are all still valid, but they become secondary. And I think similarly that for a person who's had an experience of God, once he's met God face to face, so to speak, then these other proofs and evidences do become secondary in nature, though still sound and cogent arguments.
Thank you. A question for Dr. Craig. Try to limit your question to 30 seconds.
Okay. Dr. Craig, how do you respond to presuppositional evangelical scholars such as Cornelius Van Til and Gordon Clark, who basically argued against Aquinas' verification?
Okay. I think some background here would be helpful with respect to the question. Certain Christian theologians have argued that to engage in a debate or a discussion such as we have this evening is ultimately futile, because there isn't any common ground between a believer and unbeliever on which to discuss these issues. And I hope that you've seen tonight that that's simply false. That our common ground consists, I believe, in the laws of logic, which we both accept, and in the empirical facts of experience. And on the basis of this common ground, I think we can profitably discuss what makes the best sense out of reality, what worldview makes the most sense. And so our common ground would be on the basis of laws of logic and the empirical facts of experience. Now, of course, as a Christian, I might have a different view of the foundation of the laws of logic. I would see these as ultimately rooted in God as the supremely rational mind. And I would think of empirical facts as trustworthy because God has created an orderly universe so that, say, the principle of induction works. But though I might ground these differently, nevertheless, the unbeliever and myself can share a common ground in using empirical facts and the laws of logic to try to make the best sense out of life and the universe and try to determine which worldview is the most rational.
Dr. Hughes?
Yes, clearly Dr. Craig and I have, a lot in common. We both have a common philosophical background in which we approach these topics. On the other hand, I have, in a sense, sympathy with what these evangelical theologians are suggesting, because in some ways it's rather like what I'm suggesting we do. We make a sharp cleavage between the ambitions of reason and the evidence of faith, so that we don't try and, as it were, use our reason to get outside the world with which we're familiar, and from which Dr. Craig, of course, as I mentioned, draws his examples.
Thank you. Is there a question for Dr. Hughes?
Yes. Dr. Craig referred to this earlier. He was wondering, if there is no God, then where do we get our morals? And I'm wondering, if we evolved like from an amoeba, then, which has no brain, how would we understand the difference between right and wrong?
Well, apropos of the last one, I mean, that's true of any aspect of our understanding. It's equally a problem of how we came to, if we grew up from an amoeba, how did we come to do quantum physics? And my answer to the right and wrong question is that human beings, since they became human beings, or even when they were primates, were fundamentally social. They're fundamentally social. And it was the case that certain kinds of social behaviors were self-destructive, others were not. And then there's the next stage, which is that of humans becoming reflective animals, reflecting on their activities. So that it's at that stage you start to get people who are talking about the nature of right and wrong and codifying it either in religious laws like the Ten Commandments, or reflecting on it as someone like Aristotle did and said, well, what is going on in moral education, and what can we say about the things we value in people that make them honorable people or people to esteem? And that practice is a practice which engenders a tradition and ensures great stability, whereas other practices, like the practices engaged in by the Ik in a region of East Africa, when for various reasons their social system had totally broke down, their practices were, as we might say, self-destructive. And it's from those practices that our ethical views came, which does not mean that we cannot think of them as it were, imposing obligations on us and as values we ought to aspire to and ought, in fact, to try and emulate wherever possible.
Thank you. Dr. Craig, a response?
Well, the view that Dr. Hughes has enunciated is basically the view that Michael Roos explained in the speech when I quoted him. Basically, moral values are just biological social adaptations. A mother rushing into a burning house to save her children, or a soldier throwing his body over a hand grenade to save his comrades, does nothing more praiseworthy or significant, morally speaking, than a fighter ant which sacrifices itself for the ant heap. It's the selfish gene programming in this altruistic behavior to perpetuate the species. And if that's what ethics are, then there is no right and wrong. There is no such thing as moral obligation. There are no such things as objective moral values. These are just biological adaptations, and there's no reason that we should order our lives or conform our behavior to such things.
Question for Dr. Craig.
Concerning the illusion of free will, If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and He is the creator, then things must turn out according to His design. And that means that we're on a track that we can't get off of. And there's no reason for punishment or reward in an afterlife, no need for heaven or hell.
If you're interested in this subject, I spent about 5 years working on the question of divine foreknowledge and human freedom, and there's a couple of books on the book table back there that I've written on this area. It seems to me that the person who reasons in this fatalistic manner is basically committing a modal logical fallacy. He reasons as follows. Necessarily, if God foreknows that X will happen, and let X be any event, necessarily, if God foreknows that X will happen, then X will happen. Premise 2, God foreknows that X will happen. Conclusion, therefore, necessarily X will happen. X must happen, as you said. That is simply a modal fallacy. That is a logically fallacious inference. All that you can infer from those two premises is that therefore X will happen. But you cannot infer that X will happen necessarily or that X must happen. X could fail to happen. But if it were to fail to happen, then God would have foreknown that instead. His foreknowledge would have been differently. So that even though God's foreknowledge is chronologically prior to the events are logically prior to God's foreknowledge. The foreknowledge doesn't determine the events, it's the events that determine what is God's foreknowledge. It's kind of like a shadow and the person who causes a shadow. If you're standing at a corner and you see the shadow of someone approaching on the sidewalk, by seeing the shadow, you know that there is a person who is coming. But it's the person who is determining the shadow. The shadow doesn't determine that the person is coming. The shadow only sort of tells you in advance of what's going to happen. Similarly, God's foreknowledge is kind of like the foreshadowing of the events that will transpire. From seeing His foreknowledge, we know what will happen, but that doesn't allow you to conclude that therefore they must happen. They could fail to happen, but if they were to fail to happen, then God would have had different foreknowledge instead.
Dr. Hughes?
I take it one of the questions that doesn't answer is the question of whether we're at fault or responsible for the actions. If the action is going to happen, well, it happens. Why has that become, if it's an action of mine, and timelessly it was going to happen? How am I responsible for the fact that it happened?
Thank you. This will be our last question.
Dr. Hughes, it's my understanding that you think ethics are culturally relative. In some cultures, they love their neighbor. In other cultures, they eat their neighbor. Can you give us a reason, an absolute reason, why we should say one of those is right and one of those is wrong?
I don't think, first of all, there is quite as relative as you suggest. There's an enormous commonality between various kinds of culture. And one of the things that also happens is that traditions modify and we become aware of certain things which we weren't aware of before. So that, for instance, we become aware, for instance, that the things that we have in common with people in other nations, people on other continents, are much greater than the things which divide us. And so we become aware that certain kinds of attitude which we hold towards those in our immediate group, that there's no reason why those should not be applicable to other members of the human race. I very much reject the view that to say that something's origins lay in in kind of the combination of biology and social arrangements, that someone whose origins lay there, that fact, as it were, implies they don't have objective validity. They do have objective validity, whatever their origins are. because they're now a subject of scrutiny and discussion, and we become morally aware agents. We develop a moral discrimination by ruminating on our social practices and developing out of that. Now, in 2 minutes, I can't actually explain this view in any great detail, but it's not simply that we're biological organisms of a certain kind, or simply that we're organized in societies as we are. Those two things, even taken together, aren't enough to account for the way we make moral judgments now, and the kind of moral judgments we make, and also the way in which a notion like obligation, or a notion in which of right and wrong, entered into our common language. This is a notion in our common language.
Thank you. Dr. Craig?
Certainly, it's correct to say that showing the origins of something doesn't invalidate that that thing has an objective foundation. I would say, however, our moral sense originated, nevertheless, it has an objective foundation in God. But the problem with the atheistic view is that having gotten rid of God, there isn't any objective foundation left. All you've got is the sociobiological origin of these beliefs, and there's no grounds for thinking there's anything more than that. You can see this perhaps by imagining a race of extraterrestrials who are as superior to us in intelligence as we are to cattle and horses. And suppose they were to come to Earth and decide to farm the Earth and use us for food and laboring animals. On the relativist view, what could you say to them? That we human beings think this was wrong? Well, they would say, that's fine for your human morality, but that doesn't affect us. That's just a product of your evolutionary biology. And we can use you for food and labor just as you use lower forms of life for the same thing. On the relativistic view, I can't see any answer to that. You need to have a transcendent ground of value, an absolute ground of value, which I think is readily provided for by belief in Christian theism.
Thank you. We'd like to express our appreciation to the ladies and gentlemen who asked the questions this evening. We certainly would like to thank the two gentlemen who presented their views very eruditely this evening. On behalf of the Department of Philosophy and the Campus Crusade for Christ, we certainly want to thank you for your attendance and your attention. Hope you have a good evening, and thank you for coming.